Awesome. So welcome. As Hayden said, my name is Sherrod Johnson. I live in the Boston area. I'm the executive director of Transit Matters. I'm a housing advocate. I'm on the board of Abundant Housing Mass. I'm also terminally online, a reply guy, et al., all of those things. But yeah, so a little bit about Transit Matters. We're a Boston-based transit advocacy group that works on trying to bring, world best practices, technical advocacy, and sound transportation policy. But so we can get to the meat of it. We just like to say that we're, data-driven, people-focused. So I want to talk a little bit about, transportation inequity and sort of what that looks like, what it means for the riders, and then how we can advocate for better transit and better transportation solutions with these inequities in mind. So, I think it's easy to talk in generalities, but I really want to focus on what inequity looks like on the streets of Boston and the surrounding communities. And a huge part of that is just underinvestment. So for those who, aren't familiar with Boston's history or only got to Boston recently, Boston's Orange Line used to run above ground through the South End, Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, some of Boston's Black and brown neighborhoods. And while it wasn't universally loved, it did give low-income and minority residents a fast commute. But it was torn down in the 80s, because of sort of disinvestment and the fact that the infrastructure was getting old. And the city and the state sort of promised that they would have something equal or better. And so, in the 90s and early 2000s, the Commonwealth spent about $600 million in today's money to build a new bus rapid transit line. And you can see the result here, these beautiful, massive stations. But that investment was miles from the old Orange Line corridor in what was at that time a nearly empty, derelict dockyard district that the city was building a sort of a new downtown. And so only about a tenth of that amount was spent on the corridor with the existing residents, the Black and brown residents in the South End, Roxbury, South End and Roxbury, and this bus rapid transit facility had no separated lanes. And while they were better than most bus stops, they were not up to the standard of those cavernous stations that I showed you before. And also, the state of inequity in our transportation system is also an issue of prioritization. Here's the Tobin Bridge. It's one of the main thoroughfares into Boston from the Northeast, but it imposes, noise and blight and pollution into the Latino communities that are north of downtown Boston for the benefit of wealthier, whiter commuters. And while it's a grueling commute for all, it's especially grueling for these folks. Many of the bus routes are disproportionately patronized by Latino residents. And even though the Tobin is a toll road, these residents in the buses take up a fraction of the space, emit far less carbon, but they actually pay more for the slower route than the suburban drivers. And the design of streets in a lot of American cities, and Boston included, is dangerous for all users, including those in cars, but it's especially dangerous for cyclists and pedestrians. And some of the worst roads in the region are through Black and brown communities. And Black and brown cyclists are also killed at a higher rate. And an example of that prioritization and disinvestment is sort of what one of the main corridors into Boston in downtown Boston from Dorchester looks like compared to what one looks like in Cambridge. So what's the impact? How does this manifest itself in people's daily lives? Well, our friends at Livable Streets found that Black bus riders spend about 64 more hours on the bus than their white counterparts, and Latino residents 10 more hours. And the reason the Latino residents fare a little bit better is because of the proximity of those communities to downtown Boston. This is, to the left here, we've got a map from the regional planning office that shows some of the most congested corridors for bus riders. And as you can see, these are two of the main corridors from Boston's Black and brown communities and have some of the highest delay times. Thankfully, there are projects underway that are addressing some of these. Another thing that's also interesting to point out too is that while the corridors in Brookline and in Boston's Back Bay neighborhoods, which are very wealthy neighborhoods, are also congested, it's important to make sure we talk about those, because while the segments of street are in wealthier, whiter communities, a lot of the folks on those buses and facing those delays are Black and brown transit riders. And then just a little interesting footnote is they actually don't even have the data for that section of bridge that I showed you earlier, but it is a significant impediment. And that's actually going back to what I was saying earlier about the discrepancy between the additional time Latino and Black bus riders spend. I would imagine some of that discrepancy comes from the fact that they don't have the data for some of the corridors with the highest amount of travel. Another huge barrier is cost, and that often contributes to transit inequity. So a friend of Transit Matters and a data scientist, Anson Stewart, ran an analysis on what would be the impact of simplifying the T's complex and expensive fare system for their commuter rail. And so we see that Lynn is only about 9 miles from downtown Boston, but the fare on the commuter rail is just over twice that of the subway and 3 times that of local bus trips. And you can see, here we've got a slide that shows you the travel times and just how much cheaper it is. And it's really, it's essentially a time tax. And actually the figure that's quoted here for the local trip is even cheaper if you have a Charlie card. So again, that shows just a huge difference of $240, but your trip's gonna take an hour and 7 minutes versus if you're able to afford the $7, your trip would only be 30 minutes. And building on that last slide around travel time, Anson worked with some folks at Boston Indicators to show us another stark example. It shows us 2 fictional people with very real scenarios. So we've got John here that lives in mid-Cambridge, and he takes a 69 either to the red or the green line. His trip takes about 40 minutes, but within his total commute time, he has access to about 9 municipalities and over 480,000 jobs. Alicia, who lives in Mattapan, takes about 10 minutes longer, but she's only able to reach half as many jobs in just 3 cities. Bumping it up to an hour will get her a similar amount of jobs, but 30 minutes a day adds up. And there are other people who live further into Mattapan who have even fewer jobs available with that 45-minute threshold. When we look at the racial demographics of the area, the impact becomes a lot clearer. Black people only make up about 4% of folks in John's neighborhood, and Latino residents only about 8%. And these numbers are skewed because of Harvard, which I think makes the numbers look even worse. That if the university wasn't there, it would might even be even less diverse. Mattapan, on the other hand, is 89% minority and 81% Black. Again, going on with this theme of fair and equity, our friends at Mass Inc., who do a lot of work around gateway cities, and to explain about that, gateway cities are these post-industrial mill towns that are often at the edge of the Boston metro area. And so we have this unique feature that as you get further away from Boston, you do actually have fairly large, cities, large for, Massachusetts, 40, 50, 60,000 people that have a huge immigrant population, have lower incomes, and yet these are the folks that have to pay the most for commuter rail. So this chart, shows what percentage of the median income has to go to pay for a commuter rail there. And Lynn is, one of the starkest examples. Lynn is around the station area, about 2/3 of the station area are low income, but yet only 6% of the riders on the commuter rail are low income. And there have been some pilots and some outreach that have slightly improved this, but the perception and the frequencies mean that a lot of folks have, stayed away, and that pilot has actually been halted. And what's even more, wilder is the issue of sort of where revenue comes from. And so you look at just how much transit fares have increased in the last 30 years, yet the gas tax has only gone up about 14%. So, huge issue there. We can look at, any number of metrics to show how Boston's minority neighborhoods are disproportionately impacted, from crashes. Some of the most dangerous streets run through neighborhoods like Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester, Arrow Strait, highway-like stroads. They invite speeding, bad behavior, and prioritize suburbanites over local bus riders, pedestrians, and cyclists. This long, continuous blue line you see here is Blue Hill Ave. a corridor that was highlighted in the travel time slide, and one that we'll talk about later. But Streets blog Mass found that while Black people only make up about 8% of Massachusetts' population, crashes involving cyclists and pedestrians were made up of, a quarter of the fatal crashes involving cyclists and pedestrians happened in Black neighborhoods. And so, while Transit Matters' main focus is on transit, every transit rider is a pedestrian at some point in their journey. And the city commissioned a study on sidewalks, that's this map here to the left, and it found that 65% of the sidewalks in Roxbury and Dorchester were in no better than fair condition, while in downtown Boston and Back Bay, 68% of the sidewalks were in good condition. And of course, transit is more than just the absence of high quality, transit and affordable fares and life-saving infrastructure. It's also the presence of health-harming infrastructure, namely the highways and these, aforementioned traffic sewers. And this purple map, shows you, it shows a really sad figure of the childhood asthma rates by neighborhoods. While there are other factors like indoor air quality, industrial pollution that play a part, transportation is a really key contributor. And the abundance of highways encircling Chinatown, along with idling diesel trains and lots of coach buses, give Boston's Chinatown neighborhood, the unfortunate statistic of having the worst air quality in New England and Massachusetts. And here we've got our then councilor, now Mayor Michelle Wu, talking about that. And so, there's a better way here. And so knowing all of that, what would a better way look like? Bus lanes to give transit riders the priority. Easy access for families, especially working parents. Transit that would be safe and easy to use for children. Affordable housing next to transit. Access for people with disabilities. An inclusive cycling culture. Lowering the barriers to access, including in some cases making things free. Placemaking solutions that center community and artists, and connecting residents to opportunity, as well as just totally rethinking how we use our streets and what amount of space we set aside for the greenest and most efficient modes. So how do we get there? It's not going to be easy, whether it is politicians distracted by incredibly stupid plans to move people around, whether it is, crushing deficits that are happening as a result of COVID, and, the slow return to transit agencies, and, pushback from neighborhood residents about transit projects and their potential gentrification impacts. And, touching on that, that last, that last slide, that image, which is what I was talking about earlier, a BRT corridor that would tackle Blue Hill Avenue, which is again that street, one of the main streets pointed out in the map of major bus delays, and was that blue line that had a ton of pedestrian and cycling, crashes. There's a project that should be, something really exciting and should have the community rallying around it. But, there were a lot of folks who were upset about it. And, when the story broke on Twitter, there were a lot of replies from well-meaning white transportation and active transit users. But I think they missed, some of them missed the point, and I think while it's critical to push back on the falsehoods about, bus and bike lanes causing traffic, or the idea that there are no minority bike riders, we have to make sure that we don't dismiss all concerns. And so another friend of Transit Matters, Charlie, bravely engaged with one of the main naysayers who was saying that, that this corridor, we're just talking about the bus and we're not talking about, the fact that there are no sit-down restaurants on this corridor, or we're not talking about, lack of affordable housing. And Charlie said, yes, I agree. We should talk about gentrification and displacement. We should talk about economic development and beautification. And so we have to make sure that we're not dismissing real concerns. So, what would that look like? LA provides a fascinating example where LA Metro and the city and various other entities partnered with the community to build an open air museum and cultural space along the new Crenshaw line. And the project included supporting local entrepreneurs like the late Nipsey Hussle, and included local housing nonprofits. And here in Boston, the T turned over one of the parking lots next to the Mattapan line for affordable and mixed use housing. And so, I know it's really critical to support transit projects and agencies that are constantly under attack, but we as advocates have to, avoid carrying water for the transit agency and avoid overlooking legitimate concerns. We should be pushing transit agencies to work with nonprofits to create affordable housing and stimulate economic development along the line. We should be pushing them to make sure that projects reflect the community that they're in, and to push to make sure that transit agencies are disposing of excess or underutilized land with the highest use and not just the highest price in mind. And if I can do a shameless plug, the incredible, our incredible data visualization team at Transit Matters, our TM Labs, has been putting out incredible data tools that take the MBTA's raw data and allow for just about anybody to see travel times and delays. And this data gives, not only Transit Matters, but also our grassroots partners and riders in environmental justice communities themselves, the tools to validate their experience and to quantify the impact of those inequities. And so, working with local research institutions, nonprofits, or even just transit nerds on Twitter, you can take that data that in many cases is open source and create something that allows you to bolster your argument. Another key thing that helps the advocacy in the Boston region is deep engagement. Our friends at Livable Streets have been running the Street Ambassador program for years. And so they talk to local businesses ahead of a bus lane pilot to, assuage their fears and actually to help shape the process, to include a loading zone, where that's a major issue for folks along the corridor. They survey bus riders about how the bus lanes are working and so much more. And, having this qualitative and quantitative data is really critical to informing conversations and winning over hearts and minds. And I know because I had this experience just last week. Again, going back to Blue Hill Ave, one of the main critics worked with one of the city councilors to hold a town hall, hopefully, planning, or in his mind, planning to sort of raise that there were, concerns around parking and to get, elected officials and other folks to stop or slow down that project. And I was able to talk about, I was able to be armed with the data from our friends at Livable Streets about how another similar center running bus lane project, had gone. And I was able to use that information from both our TM Labs team and that report on just how much additional time Black and brown bus riders spend in delays. And all the things that I mentioned at the top of this section, can make the road ahead feel really difficult, but, it's not a fait accompli. We have to push our policymakers not to get distracted by, the latest shiny thing, electric vehicles. We can remind them about how the obsession over Uber and Lyft solving traffic problems went. Spoiler alert, poorly. They actually increased traffic. And we have to raise the equity concerns of low-income folks waiting for rebates, or how charging is going to work in multifamily housing, the ongoing costs that, even if you're able to get a significant rebate to low-income folks, the increased cost to actually charge the vehicle, and of course, traffic and traffic violence that EVs don't solve. And while I don't have all the answers on free bus or free fares, it will depend on your city and what percentage fares make up of the agency's budget, but we shouldn't avoid the conversation. And I think it's forcing uncomfortable conversations with policymakers about the unsustainability of fares in some systems, or at least a high reliance on them, especially on events like COVID. And of course, some of the regressive nature of them. But we should be pushing for free pair of pilots. We should be trying to shift the Overton window so that low-income fares or across-the-board fare cuts seem like no-brainers. We should also continue to push for more street space for buses, cyclists, pedestrians, commerce, and community space. The pandemic showed us just how much of our streets we just waste. We don't even think about, but we just set them aside to cars and not think about what are the other opportunities. And what was really interesting is a poll in Boston showed that people love the outdoor dining and safe cycling space so much that they wanted to see more of it, even if it meant that there was less space for cars. And so I invite you to highlight the success stories from the past 2 years in your own community. And as my friend Stacy says, your pilot is the process, or at least a significant part of it. It's hard for people to form opinions about what a peak hour bus lane might look like and what it's going to do to the street if it doesn't exist, that they haven't even seen it. And so, in wrapping up, just some of the things to look at when we're thinking about inequity and sort of how it manifests itself. It's travel time, it's job access. It is, looking at what's the difference in travel times based on the mode, and how often, buses get the short end of the stick, and how, things like commuter rail fare and sort of the fare structure around commuter rail is inherently inequitable. We can look at air quality.
He's going to be here around 2:30.
We can look at air quality and asthma rates, particularly relevant for right now. We can look at access to COVID testing sites and vaccine locations, crash data, as well as the condition of sidewalks and bus stops in communities. And how do we make those changes equitably? Again, it's listening to community, and not just simply, listening to reply, but actually listening and picking out, what are the real, concerns here. If there is a concern about parking, how do we work to make sure that there's loading zones? How do we think differently about parking on side streets? I think it's incorporating key priorities like jobs, economic development, housing, arts and culture. Not only because these are things that are going to help build support for these projects, but also it's so much better when we have allies from different sectors that are able to speak to how important transportation and equitable transportation is to all of their priorities. Using data and community engagement to make your case. And then finally, flipping the argument, whether it's on EVs, whether it's on fares and access, or whether it's on the allocation of street space. So thank you, and love to open it up for questions.